I have the privilege of being the lead-off teacher to introduce Dietrich Bonhoeffer under the kind of rubric, does he still speak to us today? And so, by the way, I'm sitting on my back deck at my home in Atlanta, and I'm seeing way too much of myself right now. So I guess here I am. I guess that's what you all are seeing as well. So, so what I'm going to do for about 35 minutes today is offer kind of different forays into an introduction to Bonhoeffer, and and hopefully by the end I will have set us up for what the rest of the series is going to look like. This is not anything in depth today. It's more like where does one get started with Bonhoeffer? And so I'm going to share my screen because I have a handout. I hope you all can see that. Bruce, do you see that on the screen?
Perfect. Yeah.
If I were doing this in a room with 20 people and we had plenty of time, I would start off with these two questions. What image or knowledge of Bonhoeffer do you have coming into this class, and what are you most hungry to learn about in this study of Bonhoeffer? So if I were to open that up now, that'd probably be all we would do today. So I think I'll just let you think about those questions for a second, and let me just kind of walk through my handout here, and I can also make this available, Bruce, to, if you want to have that as part of the archive of the class.
Great, thank you.
So some kind of opening reflections and contextualizations. One of the things I think about is that not 1 in a million people, Christians or anybody else, is really studied by other people 75 years after their death. And it's been 75 years since Bonhoeffer was executed by the Nazis. So this immortality in that sense, vocational or professional or personal immortality where people still remember you 75 years after you're gone, is really very unusual. I mean, I don't know if you can see this. This is my Dietrich t-shirt here. I am currently wearing my Dietrich t-shirt. How many people have t-shirts made of them, right? I mean, I don't think there are any Gushee t-shirts. There may not be any Andrea White t-shirts yet, but there are Dietrich t-shirts, right? So why is that? It probably says as much about us as it does about the people, that we select certain people to study and remember and honor long after they're dead. If one were just to go back to the Nazi period, you could ask, well, why is it Bonhoeffer? Why don't we have t-shirts of his fellow conspirator Helmut von Moltke, who was also executed by the Nazis and was also very brave? What about Paul Tillich, the famous theologian? I don't think there are any Tillich t-shirts out there. What about Heinrich Gruber, who was a pastor in Berlin who spent the entire war secretly hiding Jews, along with a network of mainly women Protestants? What about Karl Barth? Of course, everybody who studies theology knows about Karl Barth, but he also was an anti-Nazi resistor. Whereas Barth got to live out his entire life, dying in, I think it was 1968, Bonhoeffer's work was partial, and his life was cut short at 39. So why? Why Bonhoeffer? I want to propose, to start off, certain ideas. One is that Western Europeans and many Americans remain fascinated by the Nazi era. We'll start there. The regime, the era, what happened during that period, and the especially horrific crimes of the Nazis, especially the Holocaust. So for a lot of us, this is not universal around the world by any means, but for a lot of us, some of our formative learning about the world in which we live in was shaped by learning about the mid-20th century, the Nazi regime, their 12 years of terror, and the Holocaust in World War II. I myself began my career writing about this period when I wrote a book called Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust, published in '94. That was my Union Seminary dissertation, Andrea, under the supervision of Dr. Larry Rasmussen, in which I studied Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and it ended up being published the next year as Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust. So that's how my whole career began. As for Bonhoeffer himself, I think his story is both fascinating and unique. He was a superstar on his way up by the age of 27, he had 2 doctoral dissertations done. He was starting his career at the University of Berlin. He was popular. He was charismatic, a pastor and a scholar. But unfortunately, or fortunately, providentially, the dawn of his career happened at exactly the same time as the rise of Adolf Hitler. So he was a person, maybe that's one reason why I was so struck by him at the beginning of my career. It's not easy to get started in an academic career, not easy to sustain one, but he threw his away in a sense, in that he went all in to resist the Nazis, and he got executed. His whole career was consumed by this resistance effort, and he ended up being killed just 3 weeks before the end of the war. This separates him from all the others that I mentioned above. I think, thirdly, here under this first point, the perceived congruence of his thinking and of his life attracts people. The church is always looking, and humanity in general is always looking and rarely finding that kind of congruence between ideas and life. Always looking for integrity and courage, always looking for role models, and so often disillusioned when people you think you can believe in turn out to be not worthy of it. And especially when you study the gross failures of the German churches during the Nazi period, to find somebody who seemed to have mainly gotten it right when everybody else didn't is a major contributor to why attraction to Bonhoeffer has spread all around the world. Also, fourth, German theology played a huge role in shaping Anglo-American theology in the 19th and 20th centuries. Everyone getting a PhD had to learn German because so much important theology happened. I had to pass a German exam. I did not love it, but I learned. So there were strong connections between the elite German and Anglo-American scholarly worlds, and American scholars were always reading German theology. So Bonhoeffer comes from, you might say, the center of what was seen as kind of headquarters theology at that period. I would also say one reason people are interested in Bonhoeffer is that the time gap is not really that large. I knew some people who personally knew Bonhoeffer. That's 1 degree of separation. If he had lived a full, long life, he would have died in the 90s, maybe later. So it wasn't really that long ago. And we're still processing what happened in that period and what it means. So Bonhoeffer, in one sense, is kind of a contemporary. I teach a great moral leaders class, and I teach the class chronologically, and Bonhoeffer is still one of the more recent ones. Also, Bonhoeffer had extraordinarily broad connections around the world for such a young man. Well before his death, he had already done enough provocative writing that people were studying it. And he left even more provocative, unfinished work that hopefully will be talked about during this class, not today necessarily, but other days. And he also, this is really pivotal, he had a particularly devoted biographer, best friend, and you might say the protector and advancer of his legacy, Eberhard Bethke, who was his literary executor and representative until his death in the early 90s, as I recall. So you might say that beginning shortly after World War II, what could be described as a Bonhoeffer phenomenon began that continues really unabated to this day. And that leads to the next section. Bonhoeffer has been received in stages. And these stages are not hard and fast, but I'm borrowing here from my friend Stephen Haynes, who teaches at Rhodes College in Memphis. Haynes suggests that there have been various versions of Bonhoeffer that have circulated since the 50s. And when we understand that Bonhoeffer has been received in stages, that there's a Bonhoeffer phenomenon, but it's not one thing, it helps us complexify our understanding of him and also beware of making our preferred myth out of Bonhoeffer. So this idea that people's work continues long after they die and that they are remembered in stages is sometimes called reception. Same thing with like biblical books. I'm working on a study of the book of Job right now, and the book of Job has been received in various stages, and that's true with Bonhoeffer. He's been received in stages. So this is how Haynes describes the stages, 4 stages, and that was in early 2000s, so one could add more now. But the first stage he calls the radical Bonhoeffer, or Bonhoeffer as seer. The first writing of Bonhoeffer that most Westerners, Americans in particular, read was actually his last collection, Letters and Papers from Prison. So that hit in the early 60s, and in terms of being taken very seriously here in the U.S. So I think of this Bonhoeffer, the radical Bonhoeffer, as the 60s Bonhoeffer. When you read Letters and Papers from Prison, it's a very different kind of voice for Bonhoeffer. He's speaking about the absence of God, about the fact that God is not going to come down at the end of this thing and rescue us, about religionless Christianity, about the church mainly just being about prayer and social justice, and the fact that it was written from prison, a Nazi prison. All of this was very attractive to radicals at this period who were talking about the absence or even the death of God, who were resisting the Vietnam War, and some of whom were themselves in prison. So Bonhoeffer as 60s political prisoner, 60s guy, resistor, theological skeptic, this was kind of the first stage of Bonhoeffer reception here. Second stage, Haynes says, is Bonhoeffer as prophet. You might call this the liberal Bonhoeffer. The Bonhoeffer who was a patriot, but was a critical patriot, resisting Nazism to the point of death, who bore a radiant Christian ethical witness in society from the earliest days of his career, both through what he was doing in the ecumenical movement, through his peacemaking, and even his strongly articulated pacifism in the early 30s, and through his quite striking work, Discipleship, used to be called Cost of Discipleship, and then secondarily the book Ethics, which he never quite finished, but is still in good enough shape you can study it and you can teach it. My teacher was Glenn Stassen of Southern Seminary and Fuller Seminary, and he loved this Bonhoeffer, the Bonhoeffer of Discipleship, the peacemaker, the ecumenist, Christian ethicist, critical patriot, bearing social witness in a dark time. Haynes goes on to say that there's a third stage, kind of Bonhoeffer as apostle, and he talks about the conservative and evangelical Bonhoeffer, surfacing more in the 90s, emphasizing the conservative themes in his theology and his ethics. There's a conservative strain running through Bonhoeffer, notably in family life. Some of his writings can easily be picked up for somewhat more hierarchical thinking. And also that element of the evangelical world that was about kind of radical discipleship in community would have been especially attracted to Discipleship and the work Life Together, written when he was running a seminary. Sometimes this Bonhoeffer gets pretty poppy, pretty Gushee, we might say. Novels, kind of Bonhoeffer as evangelical superstar, youth group Bonhoeffer, this kind of guy. One fairly awful recent expression is in Eric Metaxas's biography of Bonhoeffer, which became unduly popular. And then, to me, just to be a little self-revelatory, when Metaxas especially claimed that anybody who took Bonhoeffer seriously in 2016 had to support Donald Trump. That's a long way from my understanding or Glenn Stassen's understanding of Bonhoeffer. But it does raise questions about how far can Bonhoeffer be taken. Finally, Haynes talked about Bonhoeffer as a bridge, kind of the universal Bonhoeffer. So this is Bonhoeffer leaving the Western context and going global. So Bonhoeffer, the prisoner of conscience. Bonhoeffer, the modern martyr in a world full of martyrs. The spiritual mentor to millions around the world who aren't even Christians. Soul healer, rescuer, agent of reconciliation. Bonhoeffer for all humanity. Bonhoeffer plus Dalai Lama, you might say. Here, Bonhoeffer sails into the stratosphere of the world's handful of kind of spiritual superstars. An interesting question for us to consider is whether the reason we have so many Bonhoeffers is because Bonhoeffer's work had such different stages that you might say pick a stage and pick your favorite Bonhoeffer. In other words, did he change that much? Was his work not fully integrated because it was written under pressure and he was so young? Or is it we who are evolving? We who are asking different questions of Bonhoeffer. And when I come back on August 9th, I'm going to look at Bonhoeffer's works in series and offer my own interpretation of the answer to that question. A third thing I think needs to be considered, and that is where I first encountered Bonhoeffer actually, and I haven't really fully even mentioned it yet, and that is Bonhoeffer, Jewish-Christian relations and the Holocaust. Bonhoeffer, in his book, Stephen Haynes's book called The Bonhoeffer Legacy, he notes that Bonhoeffer plays a unique and contested role in Jewish-Christian dialogue and post-Holocaust theology. I mentioned that my first book was on Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and so that particular scholarly community is where I began my career. Dr. White, have you ever heard of the Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and the Churches?
Is that with Vicki Barnett?
Yeah, she's been heavily involved with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So those conferences began in the 70s, and that was where I started to go to those meetings while I was at Union as a PhD student in the late 80s. And so Franklin Littell, a Baptist theologian, historian, was the original one who dreamed up the Scholars Conference. He's long deceased now. But along with his Jewish wife, Marcia Littell, they orchestrated these really quite dynamic conferences every year that still exist. Franklin Littell was somebody who I believe met Bonhoeffer, or at least knew people who knew Bonhoeffer. And I met some interesting people at those meetings. But at those meetings, you had an entire community of scholars focusing on the implications of the Nazi era, the German church struggle under Nazism, and the Holocaust for Jewish-Christian relations today and for theology and ethics today. And that was kind of where I first started doing scholarship, kind of before Society of Christian Ethics and before AAR. It was these Scholars Conference events. And so here's some questions that kind of came out of those meetings. And if we had more sessions, I would probably want to do one on this. So questions like this: what role did the very young Bonhoeffer actually play in the Kirchenkampf, the German church struggle? That was the period from essentially 1933, when Hitler came to power, until about 1938, when it was pretty much over, in which the Nazis were trying to bring German Protestantism under their total control, like they were trying to bring every other cultural institution in Germany under their total control. And the established Protestant churches, known as the German Evangelical Church, had to decide how to respond. Were they going to cooperate with the Nazis? Were they going to resist? If they were going to resist, on what grounds were they going to resist? What made this all the more complicated was, because Nazism was, you might call, a viral ideology, a significant minority of the German pastors, the German Protestant pastors, were really quite pro-Nazi and were quite sympathetic to allowing Nazism to dominate the churches and also to affect German Christian theology. And so the confessing church, Bekennende Kirche, was the name for the minority of the German evangelical church leadership who said a clear no to Nazism and to Nazi infiltration of the German Protestant theology. So they were a resistance movement, and Bonhoeffer was part of that. He was 27 years old in 1933. He was far more involved in the leadership of that struggle than anybody 27 years old should have been. He was just that good and that clear in his radical resistance. But there's quite a lot to study there. So if you then turn your attention to the confessing church, there's a lot of stuff to study there, including what was the posture of the confessing church toward Christians of Jewish birth, as well as toward non-Christian Jews in Germany. What the Nazis were trying to do was to essentially de-Christianize and de-Germanize anybody who was Jewish. And so a pivotal moment in 1933 was when the Nazis banned anybody that they defined as Jewish from leadership positions anywhere in the civil service or in the churches, which was part of the civil service, in the official churches. And so the non-Jewish Christians had to decide whether they were going to stand with those who had just been stripped of their leadership, or whether they were going to go along with it. And more broadly, they had to ask, what exactly is the state doing telling us who our ministers can be, and dividing our community on spurious racial lines? And Bonhoeffer was clear in saying that this was absolutely unacceptable for the state to do this to those that they defined as Jewish, but who defined themselves as Christian. But then this leads to the broader question, what was Bonhoeffer's posture toward non-Christian Jews, what was called the Jewish question at the time, so faithfully called the Jewish question? Did he stand up for non-Christian Jews too? And the answer is, in some ways at least, he did. But if one wants to take seriously Bonhoeffer and race, as it was understood in his context, you have to focus a lot of attention here. What did he do and say in relation to Jewish people, as defined either by the Nazis or by themselves? When you move ahead to the Holocaust period, there's a fair body of research about what exactly did Bonhoeffer know when the Holocaust was going on. If we define the Holocaust tightly as starting when the Nazis started slaughtering Jews as a people en masse, which really did not begin until 1941, I think it's pretty clear that Bonhoeffer knew far more than the average German about what was going on, because he was located in the Abwehr, the military intelligence unit, and because he had highly placed friends. And so you can see in his ethics that he's aware. It's subtle, but he's aware that mass killing is happening on the Eastern Front. There's also a really interesting question as to whether Bonhoeffer himself should be classified as a rescuer. In an operation called Operation 7, Bonhoeffer was involved in ferrying some German Jews out of Germany, I think it was to Switzerland, and his involvement in that was very risky, and was one of the things that he was investigated for when he was under arrest. Jewish and Christian friends of Bonhoeffer proposed to the state of Israel that he should be identified as a righteous Gentile of the Holocaust, like another 20 or 25,000 of people who have been identified as such. But the museum there, Yad Vashem, in their investigation decided the evidence was not quite strong enough, and so he was never classified as a righteous Gentile, which is interesting. And then finally here, can Bonhoeffer's writings, his life and witness, contribute to Christian post-Holocaust theology, or do we need to move beyond him? And so you can actually parse Bonhoeffer's writings and see what he says about Jews and the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, between God's covenant with Israel and God's covenant with the church, and see some areas that are problematic, as well as some areas that are promising. And so that's a specific type of conversation about Bonhoeffer that I just want to put on the table, because it's not what people are really thinking about outside of that that world so much right now. Okay, now last section, and then I'll throw it open for the questions and plenty of time for you, Bruce, to moderate. Contextualization challenges. We do face considerable contextualization challenges in entering into the study of Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was raised in the early part of the 20th century, before World War I, in a regime long gone. He was raised in the Germany of the Kaiser, the Germany before World War I, and his family was an elite family of that era. On both sides of the family, but especially his mother's side, this was a fabulously successful, well-connected, privileged family. And so I actually was looking at an essay by my friend Victoria Barnett that she sent to me this past week. And I'd like to read a couple of quotes that she put in that essay that that are actually from Bonhoeffer, reflecting back on his family of origin. In this note, he's writing to his nephew, I believe, from prison. And he says, the cosmopolitan culture of the old middle class, I would call it upper middle class, middle class, I don't know about that, but anyway, of the old middle class tradition represented by your mother's home has created in those who inherit it a proud awareness of being called to high responsibility in public service, intellectual achievement, and leadership, and a deep-rooted obligation to be guardians of a great historical heritage and intellectual tradition. This will endow you, even before you are aware of it, with a way of thinking and acting that you can never lose without being untrue to yourself. And then in a pretty famous essay from 1942 called After 10 Years, written to other conspirators against Nazism, he wrote this: nobility arises from and exists by sacrifice, courage, and a clear sense of what one owes oneself and others, by the self-evident expectation of the respect one is due, and by an equally self-evident observance of the same respect for those above and those below. Culturally, the experience of quality signals a return from the newspaper and radio to the book, from haste to leisure and stillness, from distraction to composure, from the sensational to reflection, from the idol of virtuosity to art, from snobbery to modesty, from extravagance to moderation. So Dr. Barnett says, listen to those themes: quality, character, nobility, modesty, and moderation. And she writes, how many of us measure our daily activities by such standards? So that's the kind of family he came from. And I think that understanding him, strengths and possibly weaknesses, must be rooted in understanding this family. Also, when you learn more about them, you learn that though there was a lot of religious leadership in their history, by the time of Bonhoeffer's childhood, his family was not a church-going family. Bonhoeffer was homeschooled for the first years of schooling, which is interesting. When he was young, at the age of 11, I think it was, he lost his older brother, who was one of the many Germans who died during World War I. He lived through Weimar Germany in the 1920s, both the attempt at a modern democracy and its failure, the political chaos of that period, the fact that his family as a whole resisted both the extremes of communism and Nazism. This is a family of leaders, a smart, talented, successful, responsible family. We would want to understand Bonhoeffer as a member of the Evangelical Church of Germany and what that was like. We need to understand the German theological scene when Bonhoeffer began his education, the kind of old school culture of Protestantism represented by somebody like Harnack, versus the neo-Orthodox theology that burst on the scene with Karl Barth. So Bonhoeffer was impacted by both liberal Protestant theology and Barth's theology, and that's important to understand. Also, Bonhoeffer had a chance to travel far more than most people of his period and of his country. He went to Rome, had an amazing experience in Italy and Rome, an exposure to Catholicism that led him to be more sympathetic by far than the average German Protestant. He went to Spain. In 1930-31, he went to New York, studied semi-unhappily at Union. But as Reggie Williams talks about, and I'm going to get to in just a second, his time in Harlem, just up the street at Abyssinian Baptist Church, and with his friend Albert Franklin Fisher, was transformative. So, and also while in the U.S., Bonhoeffer did a road trip. Reggie might be able to tell us more about it, Dr. Williams, but a road trip that I believe took him all the way down across the country to the South, through the South, and then ultimately to Cuba. And so Bonhoeffer in Cuba, just picture it. You know, not too many people know about Bonhoeffer in Cuba. And we could also look at his early work, but I'll say more about that in a couple of weeks. So last thing, does Bonhoeffer still speak in 2020? Whoops, sorry. Let me zoom that again. Does Bonhoeffer still speak in 2020? This is a series of classes designed, I think, to interrogate Bonhoeffer quite intensely on the issue of racism as we are seeing it in our moment. Reggie Williams, Dr. Williams, who I believe is one of our people on this Zoom call, made an absolutely huge contribution to Bonhoeffer literature in his book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. This was also a breakthrough book that documented the impact of Abyssinian Baptist Church, Harlem, and Albert Franklin Fisher on Bonhoeffer during that 9 months that he spent in New York at Union. Dr. Williams suggests persuasively that Bonhoeffer found his encounter with Abyssinian and with African American Christianity transformative. It was transformative personally. It might even have been how he actually became a practicing Christian and not just an academic theologian. It was transformative in some ways, kind of emotionally for him. I think it loosened him and helped him to have a more vivid encounter with Jesus. And it was transformative intellectually to some extent as he engaged not just African-American theology, but also the Harlem Renaissance and the kind of the ideas floating around in African-American intellectual life during this period. So, so Dr. Williams was able to show that Bonhoeffer was able to take back to Germany, even before Hitler came to power, substantial impact. But the question that a group of us is exploring in a different setting and kind of will be exploring here is kind of how far did Bonhoeffer get in engaging what might be called normative whiteness, or the corruption of Western theology and ethics in church life by whiteness, essentially coming in and corrupting Christianity, European Western Christianity. So in light of both certain gaps in Bonhoeffer's writing and maybe in his actions, and in light of the stubborn survival of white supremacist thinking and action in the West and in the US, and in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd protests of the spring and summer, it seems a good time to interrogate Bonhoeffer and whiteness together in a more searching way. So whether Bonhoeffer still speaks to us in 2020 partly depends on how we answer the question about the relationship between Bonhoeffer and the idolatry of whiteness. How far was Bonhoeffer able to get in challenging that? If this succeeds, you might say we might have a new stage in the reception of Bonhoeffer, a 2020 stage. And I think it's needed. And I don't want to foreclose where that's going to go. Part of what this class is going to explore is, with some really fine leaders along the way, is what to make of Bonhoeffer in 2020.